We grow up in a world that praises people who are endlessly available. From a young age, many of us are taught that being a good person means always saying yes, no matter what. Love is often shown as never refusing, never disappointing, never protecting your own space. If someone asks for help, you must agree. If someone demands attention, you must give it. And if you ever turn down a request, even when it hurts you, society often marks you as selfish. But something happens when a person decides to draw a line, when they no longer join in on family arguments, when they stop taking on the emotions of everyone around them, when they start protecting their own energy instead of letting it be drained away. Suddenly, a label is placed on them: cold, harsh, uncaring, selfish. But is that really the truth? Or is it simply the case that we are witnessing a healthy act being misinterpreted as something wrong? Carl Gustav Jung, one of the most important voices in psychology, saw this clearly. For Jung, the path of growing into a whole person, the process he called individuation, means learning to separate yourself from the group. Put simply, it means being able to stay true to yourself, even in close relationships. Yet, as natural and healthy as this step is, it deeply challenges the way society works. Most social systems are built on silent rules of emotional dependence, unspoken expectations, and constant availability. So when someone begins to set boundaries, they unknowingly break a contract, an invisible agreement that says, "I'll always be here for you, even at the cost of myself." The person is not becoming cold. What has changed is their tolerance for imbalance. What once appeared as kindness was often fear, fear of rejection, fear of disappointing others. The generosity that people admired may have been hiding a desperate need to please. The loyalty others celebrated could have actually been a struggle with saying no. And when this cycle ends, the people who benefited from your endless giving are forced to face a reality they never had to before. They were not in a relationship with your true self. They were relating to a version of you that existed mostly to serve them. This is why the reaction is so intense. When someone begins setting boundaries, they are not attacking anyone. They are not being cruel. They are simply being clear. They are not rejecting others. They are choosing themselves. And this act, for many, feels unforgivable, because boundaries hold up a mirror. That mirror reflects immaturity, the inability to handle frustration, and a hidden dependence on someone else's affection. This is what we will explore in detail here. Through the lens of Jung's psychology, we will see why healthy boundaries are mistaken for coldness. We will understand why so many resist when others begin to live with emotional independence. And we will uncover how individuation, though it may be lonely and misunderstood, is one of the highest forms of self-respect and relational honesty. Jung reminds us that growing up often means losing the approval of some people, but it is in that very loss that we gain our freedom. Even today, despite all of society's progress, the old conditioning runs deep. There exists an invisible system that rewards people who erase themselves for the sake of others. From the time we are children, many of us are taught that our value depends on approval. We are told that being good means tolerating more than we should, that real love means giving up our needs again and again. Within this mindset, setting boundaries is painted as rebellion. Worse than rebellion, it is treated like a moral crime. This expectation forms a trap where being endlessly available is not just encouraged, it is demanded. To maintain relationships, you must always answer the call, always give, always show up, no matter the cost to yourself. And here lies the cruel paradox. The more of yourself you give away, the more people seem to praise you. But the moment you pull back to protect your energy, your time, or your peace of mind, suddenly you are called selfish, cold, or distant. Jung described this as emotional fusion. It is a state where people cannot tell their own feelings apart from the feelings of others. And in this type of dynamic, any step toward separation feels like abandonment. The person is no longer seen as their own being. They become an emotional extension. And so, when a boundary is placed, it shakes the illusion. What seemed like love is revealed as dependency. This conditioning is not just personal, it is cultural. Everywhere you look, the message is repeated. Movies glorify the idea of sacrifice without end. Songs celebrate people who never walk away, no matter how much it destroys them. Books and speeches praise unconditional giving. The good friend is one who is always available, even while falling apart. The perfect mother is one who never refuses, no matter the cost to her health. The ideal partner is one who accepts and forgives endlessly. Within this picture, boundaries feel like betrayal. The very idea of saying no seems to threaten the very meaning of love. But Jung offered a very different understanding. For him, real love, mature love, comes not from fusion but from difference. True closeness does not mean losing yourself inside another. It means being able to be with someone while still standing firmly as yourself. And this shift only begins when we start asking questions like, am I being kind or am I being convenient? Am I truly caring for others or am I erasing myself just to feel accepted? These questions open the door to change, and in that change an uncomfortable truth appears. Many connections we thought were built on love were actually built on utility. They lasted not because of respect, but because of dependence. And that is when resistance rises. When you refuse to take part in family conflicts, or you no longer answer draining messages right away, or you finally put your well-being first, people don't just get upset, they feel betrayed. But what exactly is being betrayed? It is not love. It is the unspoken agreement of self-denial. At this point, something powerful happens. You start to see who was benefiting from your lack of limits, and that's where the real shift begins. The first shock of setting boundaries doesn't come from inside you. It comes from the reaction of others, and those reactions reveal far more about them than about you. This is the moment when masks fall. The same people who once praised your kindness now accuse you of changing. The same people who valued your generosity now call you selfish. What is happening here is not about your actions, but about the role you used to play in their lives. Jung observed that during individuation, one must leave behind the roles given by society, and one of the most reinforced roles is the helpful person. This is the figure who is always available, always supportive, always listening, always absorbing the weight of others. But here is the truth. That role often has little to do with free choice. It is a survival strategy. It is a compulsion, not an act of freedom. For Jung, this compulsion is like a cage. When you begin to leave that role behind, you force others to face responsibilities they avoided. The friend who leaned on you to vent must now face their own loneliness. The family member who relied on you to fix their mess must now deal with their own shortcomings. The partner who depended on your tolerance to avoid growth must finally confront their own need to change. This is why it feels so disruptive. What was once projected onto you, the role of fixer, healer, therapist, suddenly disappears, and what remains is truth. Many relationships were built on dependence, not on equality. Jung explained this as withdrawing your shadow from the field of the other. In simple words, it means you stop carrying what was never yours. You break the cycle of taking responsibility for other people's feelings, choices, and failures. And for those who are not yet emotionally independent, this feels like devastation. This is where accusations of coldness come in strongest. It is not because you are cold, but because it is easier for others to blame you than to take responsibility for themselves. If they call you cold, then they do not have to reflect on their own immaturity, their avoidance, or their dependency. But if you are simply healthy and aware, then they must face their own flaws. And often, this is where relationships crack, not because you did something wrong, but because you stopped feeding an illusion. Through this break, as painful as it may be, you begin to see the difference between relationships of mutual exchange and relationships built on control, disguised as love. This brings up a critical question. How can we tell the difference between a truly cold person and someone who is simply learning to protect themselves? How do we know whether we are maturing or just shutting down out of fear? The answer lies in understanding the fine line between coldness and emotional maturity. This line is often misunderstood, and when it is, people end up making unfair judgments, false accusations, and breaking connections that might have been saved. So what really separates a mature person from an indifferent one? It is not in appearances. It is in the intention behind choices. A genuinely cold person avoids intimacy altogether. They keep walls up, not boundaries. They refuse closeness, shut out affection, and lock away vulnerability. Their distance is not a form of care for themselves, but a shield against past hurts. Coldness is like frozen emotion. It is not balance, it is a shutdown. They don't create boundaries out of respect, they create barriers out of fear. Emotional maturity, however, is the complete opposite. A mature person does not reject connection, they choose it carefully. They don't run from relationships. They build them with respect and responsibility. They don't refuse intimacy, they simply don't give it away carelessly or at any cost. Their limits are not walls, they are doors with locks, and only those with the keys of care, respect, and real presence are allowed inside. Jung saw this as the heart of individuation. For him, growth meant learning to share life with others without losing yourself. It meant letting go of childish beliefs that love means carrying another person's entire emotional world. Instead, it meant building connections where each person carries their own mind and feelings. This is not coldness, this is maturity. An emotionally mature person does not drown in the storms of others. They can listen, understand, support, but they do not erase themselves in the process. They can be fully present without becoming an emotional container for everyone else's pain. They hold on to their own energy with care, not because they want to keep it all to themselves, but so they can give it in a conscious way instead of reacting out of impulse or pressure. This type of emotional clarity can be unsettling for many people because it shows the emptiness in those who are still living out of dependency or unhealthy attachments. That is why people who are emotionally mature often get labeled as cold, not because they don't care about others, but because they refuse to drown in the messy drama of someone else's life. For people who believe that love must always be sacrifice, this refusal feels like rejection or abandonment. But in truth, it is not. Saying no to a relationship that drains you is not cruelty. It is a clear choice based on self-respect. Putting limits when someone is demanding too much from you emotionally is not selfishness. It is actually the most responsible thing you can do. Emotional maturity doesn't cancel love, it makes love more real and more meaningful. Once this clarity begins to grow, it acts like a filter. Weak connections built on projection, control, or constant need tend to fade away in front of someone who knows how to stand strong. On the other hand, real relationships built on respect and mutual growth have the chance to flourish. And this is what begins to happen when you stop acting like a character shaped only by emotions and instead start showing up as your true self. But even though this transformation is powerful, it is not free from consequences. When you set clear boundaries, something deeper always happens. You push others to face their own immaturity. And many people are not ready for that. The impact of this can be both transformative and painful. Setting boundaries is not only about protecting yourself, it is a force that changes relationships. Like a spark that speeds up a process, it forces things that were hidden beneath the surface to rise quickly. When you start saying no, when you step back from manipulation games, or when you stop meeting everyone's expectations at the cost of yourself, something predictable occurs. Relationships that were built on imbalance begin to break down. Carl Jung saw this breakdown as something natural. When you stop being an extension of another person's wishes and instead stand as your own person, you also stop supporting their unconscious fantasies about you, those who saw you as the savior. The always kind one, the forever available one, now have to face their own pain, their own anger, and their own weaknesses. For many, this is too heavy, especially if they've never had to look at themselves honestly before. Relationships that are built on emotional immaturity cannot survive clear boundaries. They are built on unspoken deals, hidden roles, and unfair exchanges. One person gives endlessly, the other keeps demanding. One listens and absorbs, while the other unloads. One sacrifices, and the other takes advantage. When that cycle is interrupted by a boundary, the system breaks, and with it, the relationship often falls. Part 2. This is the hardest part to accept. The ending of such relationships is not truly a loss, it is a revelation. What falls apart was never strong to begin with. What ends was never balanced or mutual. Jung believed that real growth requires a kind of symbolic death and rebirth. And often, this rebirth begins with the ending of relationships that stopped you from fully being yourself. At this stage, many people feel torn inside. Because even if a relationship was unhealthy, it still gave them something familiar. Maybe it was a feeling of belonging, a routine, or even a false sense of being accepted. When you break away from that pattern, fear often shows up. Thoughts like, what if I end up alone? What if nobody accepts me this way? What if I'm being too harsh? These fears are normal, and they are part of the process. They are proof that you are leaving behind the old zone of emotional fusion and moving into a new stage, emotional independence. Not every relationship that collapses when you set healthy boundaries was truly a bond in the first place. Many were hidden agreements based on roles like victim and rescuer, or on dependency, control, and submission. By breaking these unhealthy cycles, you are freeing yourself. And in a way, you are also giving the other person a chance to grow, but only if they are willing to face their own maturity. If they are not, they will leave. And if they leave, let them. The pain of loss here is not really about the other person's absence. It comes from losing an identity that was held up by their approval. What hurts is realizing you were valued not for who you are, but for what you gave. This realization can feel devastating at first, but if you look deeper, it is also freeing. This point becomes a turning place on your path, because you begin to see that real relationships do not fall apart when faced with boundaries. In fact, they grow stronger with them. They are built on clarity instead of guilt. They are fed by honesty instead of blind sacrifice. They grow not only when you say yes, but also when you say no. And this understanding opens the door to an even deeper transformation. At this point, the question shifts. It is no longer about how do I keep old relationships alive. Instead, it becomes who am I becoming as I start to live in line with my own truth? Jung's answer was clear. You are entering the process of individuation. Individuation is not some abstract idea. It is the very process of becoming whole. Jung believed that people are born incomplete, shaped and pushed by social expectations and family pressures. To become a real individual means breaking free from these invisible strings so you can be who you truly are, even if that means disappointing or distancing yourself from others. This process is like a return to your own self. But it is not easy or gentle. It asks you to face the masks you wear to be accepted. It asks you to question roles placed on you before you even knew yourself. And hardest of all, it demands you take responsibility for your own life, including the parts you always blamed on others.